Kolkata was born of a marriage of convenience between the British, who were there to make money, and a group of locals who thought, well, if there's money to be made, well, why not us? And like many children of such unprincipled liaisons, it grew up in relative neglect. Palaces went up next to swamps or slums, and the flowers in the beautiful gardens had to compete with the miasma rising from the open sewers everywhere. It took 200 years after Kolkata was founded in 1690 for the city to get proper drains and sewers. And even then, it wasn't enough. The city already had 600,000 people and growing. And now, of course, there's 15 million. To make matters worse, the city is built on a swamp between a great river and a salt lake. And the whole area is so low and flat that it's a miracle that the river just doesn't take over. When it rains hard, which it does often, the streets fill up with water, which takes days to drain. It flows everywhere, taking the refuse of the city all over the place. The ponds and lakes overflow. Fish can be seen swimming up the sidewalks. And then the hot sun cooks that soup, and the city stinks. The drinking water gets contaminated, and people get sick. Lots of people died. Yet, that being said, in the late 18th and early 19th century, there's a lot of money made in Kolkata, and not just by the British. A group of entrepreneurial locals made themselves very useful to the British, in buying and selling, in borrowing money or collecting rents, in just passing on rumors, in interpreting local customs, whether real or imagined, in arranging a nice evening with some beautiful lady of the night. And in the process, a lot of them got extraordinarily wealthy. For example, Prince Dwarakanath Tagore, who was later known as the grandfather of the great poet of Bengal, Rabindranath Tagore, but at that point, a banker, an opium trader, and eventually a bankrupt. In 1834, Dwarkanath helped found Card Tagore and Company, which was one of the first managing agencies. Managing agencies are conglomerates, investment firms that invest in everything from land to jute to mining. And they hire managers and low-paid local employees to do what these Indian intermediaries used to do. This model really flourished. It took about 25 years to wipe out the entire Banyan community. The downfall of Bengali business, in a sense, started with an innovation by one of their own. Having lost out in all of that, a lot of the Bengalis turned to real estate. Kolkata in 1830s was already a city of 200,000 and growing fast. There were lots of houses to be built and rented out, so there was work for a bunch of them. And real estate, always and everywhere, is a place where being local really pays off. The successful real estate entrepreneur needs to know who actually owns the building and not just who claims to own it, which is often different. And when there's disagreement about ownership, so 18th century Kolkata abounds with stories of 19th century Kolkata as well, of the 72 shoriks, the possible claimants of this beautiful family property which nobody can agree on, and therefore it's falling down. And it's useful to be able to, knock a few heads together and get an when an old lady unaccountably refuses to sell her house just because, let's say, she grew up there or something sentimental like that, it's useful to first go visit her, turn on the charm, call her Mashima, which is auntie, and then if that doesn't work, maybe a few bricks could land unaccountably on her terrace. Maybe people would start thinking that the house is haunted. If Mr. Sen, is late with the rent, and the best thing is to go visit him, be firm but polite. Listen sympathetically when he talks about his recent rough patch. And just when you're leaving, maybe mention that you know exactly how his daughter walks home. It takes a particular type to be a real estate entrepreneur, at least a small scale one. Maybe it's different if you are building on an industrial scale with lots of men in suits and ties running around. But if you build a few houses at a time, that's often very much the same everywhere. You spend a lot of time in the street, cutting deals, shouting at the workers, encouragingly otherwise. And that probably is very similar all over the world. These are dadas, literally elder brothers. Basically, well-connected local bigwigs, full of bonhomie but ruthless when needed. They work hard, keep their own counsel, distribute patronage judiciously, cultivating a bunch of young men of limited employability. Could be handy in throwing some bricks here and there. In the 19th century, they probably wore a dirty dhoti and a dirty white vest, the kind of vest that in Indian English is called a banyan, presumably because of that. Now they wear jeans and dark glasses, but they're brothers under the skin, and between them they got a lot of Kolkata built. And what do you do about land that's not supposed to be built on? What right does the government have to say that the useless pond could not be covered? Well, the local dada is always willing to help, to talk to the right people, get it all sorted. Of course, as long as he gets the contract to build the house. If you don't need his help, well, he's still following your project carefully. And he probably knows when that truck full of cement is about to arrive. And if some environmentally conscious local young men want to stop the truck, who do you turn to for help? I grew up among many dadas and aspiring dadas. There were very few jobs in Kolkata when I was growing up. Basically, Kolkata was the first city in India to embrace modern industry. And it had these classic 19th century industries, engineering, metalworking, jute, chemicals. And as tastes changed, people really didn't want the polluting industries next to them, and people used plastic instead of jute. The industries went into decline. In an attempt to kind of prevent the inevitable, in a sense, the unions got active. There were strikes, demonstrations, pitch battles occasionally. The Communist Party started flexing their muscles. The investors decided to stay away. And that was the beginning of the decline of Kolkata's industry. So there were no jobs. So, those who had good degrees or, great connections went elsewhere to Bangalore, Mumbai, Delhi, the US. For the rest, real estate was really one of the only things they could gamble on. The person I'll call Mishtuda, Da is short for Dada, is one of those who actually made it. He was maybe a few years older than me, but we played cricket together, or rather, he played and I pretended to play and convinced no one. Built, he's of medium height, but built like a pillar, as deep as he was wide. He started as a foot soldier. It's said that even the sight of him standing quietly in front of a rival construction site was enough to dissuade their competition. Over time, he first persuaded his uncles to let him pull down the dilapidated family house and build it into a set of flats. Then he did the same for a set of neighbors. And soon he had a reputation for someone who delivers. The stories about Mishtuda's past abound, and some of them are probably even true. There was a house a few streets over that was almost entirely empty, except for this one widow in her 80s. The entire family lived all over the world, and so it was just she who had to sign off. So Mishtuda showed up at her house with a big box of sweets and his biggest smile. And they talked about the old days and how quiet it used to be and the increasing dangers from speeding cars. And at some point, Mishtuda came to the point. He would move her to another house, a flat, give her a car and a driver, and rebuild the house into flats. And then she'd be back in a couple of years with a nice flat and a bunch of money in the bank. She said, no. What do I need the money for? I don't have any children, and no one even comes to see me anymore. Mishtuda came again, and then again. She said no. Then the brickbats started. Neighbors heard them crashing against her window bars, but apparently she was a little deaf. So Mishtuda shows up again with an even bigger box of sweets. In the next few days, lots of the neighborhood stray cats died. But she was still there, standing in her balcony, looking at what's going on in the streets. Then one day, the banister itself came loose, and there she was, hanging in the air for dear life, holding on to the banister. Fortunately, some of Mishtuda's boys just happened to be there, and they rescued her. She still didn't sell. Mishtuda admitted defeat. In any case, he had bigger fish to fry. There was a small soap factory in the area that had closed. Mishtuda somehow persuaded the factory owner to sell him the land and the city to allow him to build several 20-story buildings in an area where nothing else was more than 4. The flat sold out. Mishtuda was flush with money, and he figured out that it was time to spend. So he made generous donations to the ruling party and maybe to the other ones as well. And he noticed that some of his boys were getting too old and plump to be in the intimidation business. So he set up an NGO for them to help the elderly living alone, as it turned out. Soon his name was in the papers. There were pictures of him as a prominent social worker, cutting ribbons here and there. There was talk of him running for public office. Soon Mishtuda's name was on these massive projects. Tens of thousands of flats in hundreds of buildings, somewhere near the periphery of the city. The eastern boundary of the city, the home of the marshes and the fisheries, where the sewers and drains of the city were supposed to empty, was being turned into a land of high-rises. And so it continues, this history of haphazard construction, someone's back plot, some pond that gets quietly filled in, some old house that's turned down and built over. More Mishtudas, each more audacious than the previous one. And with every little step, every drainage channel that gets filled in, every piece of wetland that gets reclaimed, but also every plastic bag that accidentally gets thrown and ends up in the drainage system and makes it choke even more, the city's bladder comes closer to exploding. In 1978, a massive storm that brought almost 400 millimeters of rain on the city took 5 days to drain. In 2006, a much smaller storm, just 200 millimeters of water, took 10. Environmentalists scream about it, and citizens worry about being drowned in their living rooms. But the political system knows that construction is one of the few places where there's still some way to employ the boys and keep them out of more trouble. And as long as there is no other new source of jobs, no one is going to kill the one goose that lays the eggs. As Mishtuda will tell you, if you're an old friend and everyone else happens to be out of earshot, he's retired from construction, is a politician now, and very publicly worried about the environment, that the sea level is rising so fast that the city will be underwater soon. And so why worry about a few extra puddles?
na na na